welcome everyone to our session. We're very excited to be presenting what we feel is a very important topic in the world of child life, both all academic, from a student perspective and from a professional preceptor, as well as this director of child life has a background in therapy. And so we'll each be introducing ourselves. This is It Takes a Village, Perspectives on Student Mental Health. And my name is Jenny Shabbat, and I'm a professor in child life and child and family studies at Ohio University. I've been at Ohio University since 1998, and we developed our child life undergraduate and graduate program in 2007 officially. And we were very excited to say we are now an endorsed program, graduate program by the Association of Child Life Professionals. We're very proud of that. And we are a graduate program only now. We have a 4+1 program for our undergraduates. And this particular topic has an interest for me as a professor who has worked with students, as they've navigated the process and journey of becoming child life students, and even just in general of being a professor on a college campus where we are seeing many students who are arriving to campus already with diagnosed mental health diagnosis. And having worked with students who have struggled with their diagnosis, it's just always been a particular interest of mine. And I have a background in student affairs. I worked in higher education and residence life and student leadership and service learning before I went for my PhD and went through my own journey of becoming a certified child life specialist. My two co-presenters, Sam and Janine, I'm going to have them each introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Sam. I am a previous student from Ohio University under Jenny, and I graduated from OU and got my first child life role at Nationwide Children's Hospital, where I've been working for almost 2 years now. I currently work in the hematology, oncology, BMT side of child life. And I'm going to be sharing a lot more about my journey, probably more than you expected to come here today. So I will save that for later, but I'm extremely excited to be here and present my own story and my influences and mentorship with both of the other presenters, Jenny and Janine, and how much they've contributed to not only my life, but my ability to be here today and speaking with all of you. So I'm super excited.
Great. So I'm Janine Clapsaddle, and I am the Chair and Director of Client Experience for Pediatric Potential. I'm also a family therapist in private practice. And I've been a child life specialist for just about 30 years. And so I've done all different levels of clinical practice and supervision, whether that's precepting students on a hematology oncology inpatient unit, clinically supervising both preceptors and students in the internship setting. And this particular topic really marries some of my particular passions about students and student learning, along with the importance of mental health for clinical providers. And so helping to see that experience from the mental health perspective and the importance of taking care of our own mental health as students and providers is what really drew me to this topic, and then being connected to Sam and Jenny as well, and kind of mirroring this perspective into a whole ball of wax, if you will, has really been a great experience.
So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today and some context on the topic, this really came about as I started to work with Sam, and certainly I've had students who have struggled with mental health diagnosis that have disclosed this to me as they've navigated their journey. And just as a faculty, we've provided support, helping them get connected to resources. But it wasn't really until Sam came to me, and she'll be sharing her story about wanting to make sure that she was in a good place as she was embarking on her practicum, you know, moving across the United States for both her practicum and an internship, and trying to set up a plan in place. And so that's why we shaped this, to have you hear from an academic perspective, and then from Sam's personal perspective and Janine's perspective, from the professional side, and having worked with Sam and other students who have struggled with a mental health diagnosis. I'm going to be sharing with you just some current mental health trends among today's adolescents and young adults that we're seeing on college campuses. And then following that will be Sam's personal story. And following that will be some more context from Janine on some of these mental health diagnoses and ideas for preceptors and child life directors in the role that she has been in. And then we're going to, all three of us will be including pieces on just best practices and moving forward. We really see this as we've been talking about this for the past year, doing a leadership conference for the Great Lakes Association of Child Life Professionals, a leadership institute in the summer. And Sam has continued to come into my courses, my child life courses, to do presentations. And Janine and I are going to be partnering on some research in this area now that summer will be coming and the semester's over. So we're excited and really hoping that this will be a beginning conversation. So witnessing the journey from a child life perspective, and just what we'd like for everybody to do in the chat box is share a mental health trend that you see, you know, in your own observations and work with child life students, whether you've been in a preceptor role, an academic role, or even a student role, and you either have witnessed things or you yourself have experienced a mental health issue, only what you feel comfortable sharing. But we're just wanting to see in the chat box of what some of the variety of issues that you're seeing come to life as you've done education and training of our child life students. I'd like to share with you a video that was put together by the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's really important voices from college students themselves as they share facing anxiety, which is the #1 diagnosis among college students today, and the trends that we're seeing. So we'll go ahead and take some time to play that.
If I have a panic attack, it works slowly.
Sometimes it's really hard to get out of my bed in the morning.
It's very physical for me. It starts like in my chest, and then I kind of get short of breath maybe. I get the chills a lot.
Usually it starts with like obsessive thoughts.
You can't think about anything else. You can't get it out of your head.
I can't like
Hey, Jenny, we can't hear.
a lot of my
Sorry about that, everybody. I thought if I muted my
It
button,
works
you could
slowly.
hear it.
Sometimes it's really hard to get out of my bed in the morning.
It's very physical for me. It starts like in my chest, and then I kind of get short of breath maybe. I get the chills a lot.
usually it starts with like obsessive thoughts.
You can't think about anything else. You can't get it out of your head.
I can't like sit down. Like I keep pacing around.
It could be hard for me to hear things. It's hard for me to listen or understand.
Debilitating, and I can't function.
I have to push myself to just be like, okay, I have something to do, so I just can't let this beat me. Not today.
A lot of my anxiety stems from OCD, I think. It'll be stress related to school or internships or relationships with my friends.
My anxiety comes from like test anxiety and also social anxiety, being around a really large number of people.
The act of just sitting and doing nothing makes me very anxious. On the opposite side of the spectrum, if there's too much going on. So during finals week, and I'm trying to work like 20 hours a week, and I also have to study and I have to do my homework, and I'm an RA back at campus. So if there's too much going on and I am having trouble sorting it in my brain.
I had this dream too of being filmed, to be in entertainment TV, and I got here and it just seemed more impractical. And the biggest trigger for anxiety now is thinking about how undeveloped my idea of the future is.
Last minute things make it worse. I'm a planner by nature. I plan everything, but a lot of times there is no cause. I'll just experience like a constant state of anxiety that can last for over a week. I call somebody, call my mom, or call one of my friends, or I just kind of sit and breathe, take some deep breaths.
So the best thing for me to do is if I feel even a little bit of anxiety bubbling, I step out of the room. I say, this is what my therapist taught me. You just kind of have to say, this is the anxiety I'm feeling. My anxiety is at a 3 out of 10 right now. And once you say that to yourself and you recognize that that's the anxiety level that you're at, you can start to lower it back down.
I tried to teach myself to support me like somebody else would, to look at my situation from the best exterior angle I could.
Most recently this semester, I did have to drop a class because it was too much for me and I had been missing a lot of class. Recently, I started like writing out what is actually going on. 9 times out of 10, when I see it in front of me, it's not even that big of an issue.
Sometimes I have to force myself to be social. At first, it may like really get to me, but at the end, when I'm like, okay, I was able to sit at a lunch table with a group of people and talk to them. Like that's like big things for me.
Think positively, give myself encouragement, tell myself it was okay. If I ever felt like I was overwhelmed, I had to tell myself that I could handle it and that I didn't need anybody to hold my hand.
I usually just try to like talk it out with the people around me, but that can often be hard to do because you don't always want to feel like you're that person who's burdening everyone else with like your constant anxiety attacks. Sometimes when students skip class, it doesn't mean that they just don't want to be there. Sometimes they just need a day or they just need a couple hours just to chill. I think the most important thing is that like a lot of times I'll get the assignments to you. It's just going to take me a little bit longer.
I would like them to just know that I'm not that shy student that doesn't want to talk. I'm also not coming to class because I don't want to learn or I'm not serious about my education. But sometimes it's physically hard to just deal with certain things. So I'm not that kid that's gonna waste my money and not show up to class, but sometimes it is hard.
I think the faculty is very understanding about the pressures that that college kids are having. They can empathize with students.
I don't particularly feel comfortable speaking to my professors about, taking a mental health day from class. And so that's why I think it's really important to normalize this conversation around taking a day off for your mental health, just as you would for your physical health.
My school is like very activist heavy. So a lot of times they'll be like, well, we need to like reduce the stigma around mental health, and they'll say that, but there's also a culture, I think, because the job market is so competitive that like you need to have 3 internships a semester and work a job because school's so expensive and take a full class load. So if you're doing less than the person next to you, a lot of times you're just in the competition and they'll like look down on you a little bit. I can only speak from my experience as a Black student, especially as a Black female. We sometimes have to convince ourselves that we're not crazy. There's nothing crazy about dealing with anxiety, depression, whatever's going on. It's actually a lot more common than you think it is.
So what my anxiety is like is not what everyone's anxiety is like.
That I'm not mean, I'm not antisocial, I'm not stuck up or anything. I'm very nice. It takes me a minute to get used to people. If I don't feel comfortable in the situation or in the environment, I will remove myself from it.
I really try not to show any anxiety in public. A lot of people tell me that they see me, I'm a laid back person, and I go, really? You think that? It's interesting.
There is no sort of logic behind anxiety. So it's always there, but you like telling me, oh, well, you don't have to be stressed because in the long run, it's not really going to matter. Sometimes I just need someone to like sit there and, just be there while I, freak out a little bit.
If you're even questioning if you're struggling with anxiety, you should just go in and see somebody. Because if it turns out that you're not, and it's just regular student residual stress, that's fine. You can get that managed there too. But if it turns out to be a bigger problem, now's the time to seek help instead of waiting until it's debilitating.
So there you have it, some really important voices directly from students, and really representing beautifully in their words the number one mental health diagnosis that's showing up across college campuses. And this data comes from college counselors and counseling centers put into their data every year into a clearinghouse of what are the top issues that they're seeing students come to seek support. So what's missing in the data are those students who are not seeking support. And certainly that in itself is a concern as well. So keep that on your radar, that within the statistics, we also have a percentage of students that have never sought services, or perhaps they're getting services from their home therapists or, elsewhere in a community, in the community in which their college exists. And so anxiety, depression, stress, family concerns, problems with relationships, academic performance and concerns about academic performance, feelings of social isolation and loneliness, and reports of trauma. And so, together, these are collectively a very legitimate and logical issues that college students today, and even young adults who aren't enrolled in college, we recognize that there are professionals who seek the child life field who left college years ago and are back seeking their own journeys of child life. And so we don't mean to disclude those populations as well, but this is what we're seeing, and these are the most recent statistics, I believe, from 2019, and so we don't yet know what the impact of the pandemic has been. So we may see social isolation and loneliness creep up higher as our world shut down a year ago at this time, and our today's students have been living with this. And that's an underlying issue that we want to put out there, that in addition to a mental health diagnosis, we have a generation of college students moving forward that have experienced interruptions from their educational training, from their practicums and internships. How many of you in the audience have provided support for students as they've had to delay their internships, as the internships and practicums have been canceled, volunteer experiences have been canceled. I know this is something our students have been really worried and panicked about. How am I going to get my hours in when I can't get access into the hospitals yet? And so those are monumental issues for today's generation of students. And also, as we move to a virtual life, they lost a lot of their campus resources. I think college campuses have done a good job about providing virtual resources, but you also lose that personal connection, that face-to-face contacts that some students it's just very important to them, or the convenience of just walking in to where they know, in a college campus center where the counseling center may be, and so the hesitation to reach out virtually because of their own struggles with virtual learning. And then you put on that the discourse in today's society that the ACLPA has addressed beautifully, and something that we're all very proud of as today's speakers of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so students who have been personally impacted because of their social location of race, class, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity. That all plays a piece in this and adds those additional levels to what we're seeing being reported. And with election anxiety and police reform and immigration reforms and how this impacts patient care is something that is impacting our generation of college students. And we need to keep that in consideration and keep that on our radar. Some academic best practices, and I even just listening to this video, sometimes I get caught into the, why is this student not attending class? What's going on? And before jumping to conclusions, I always want to keep in mind that they may be struggling academically because of what's going on. They're not showing up for class, whether, I know I've had a lot of one-on-one with students this year who have been in tears because of their struggle with virtual learning. And our graduate students included, we're a face-to-face program and they've struggled with not being together, not being, walking down the hallway where all of our faculty are, not being able to be in the GA office and that social piece and that connection that we've really built upon and we really thrive in on our college campus. And so I have to remember, and I don't want to forget as we go back to in-person teaching in the fall, that these are the things that they're going to carry back into the classroom, the ones who have truly struggled with online and virtual learning. So, be an advocate for campus change. If your counseling services do not provide support while a student is not on campus, like they're on their internships and practicums, be a voice for change to say, how can we make sure that our students, across campus and all different majors who leave the campus community to do internships and practicums in their discipline, let's make sure that they're getting counseling services. And now that we know this virtual world, we should be able to do that. So, be advocates of this. Keep checking in with your students, not just those who are falling behind, but those that are really, excelling, and worry about them too. Sam was a gem of a student. If she didn't speak up, we may not have known that this was a student who was struggling, because we were somebody who always said, oh, Sam, you're such a gem. You're so wonderful. And I've looked at myself about how I may have contributed to the anxiety that she felt and other students have felt. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to come from a lens of really paying attention to the context of what the student might be going through. So, checking in as academics. Know and utilize your campus resources. Know where to find them. And know, even within your college community, where the resources are, where the areas of specialty are. I'm not a therapist. I'm a professor. And so I need to keep in mind of the students who need referrals and need support, and using those campus resources. I've had conversations with our counseling director. I've had conversations with our student life directors and the vice president for student services about how are we maintaining all this? How are we keeping check? I want to be a part of those conversations. Helping students identify placements when it comes to practicums and internships where they have support systems, beginning with, well, where do you have family? Applying to the hospitals that are local and close, but, we encourage students to apply all over the United States and globally. So where are some places that you have pockets of support? Let's start with there first. And if not, where can we find support? Who might I know as alumni and who work at that hospital or who live in that city because they work elsewhere? So trying to find those connections. We've gotten our dean involved. We've had a lot of Florida placements. And so there are some, particularly in the Miami area, where we have alumni. And so he has done a wonderful job of saying, okay, where do we have alumni who have said, I would love to house a student who's on a practicum or internship? And that's something we're trying to be more widespread of to help reduce some of the anxieties that come with this. And providing students opportunities to debrief. Our students are enrolled in practicum and internship courses. We have our clinical professor who oversees that, Janelle Mitchell. And so making sure that students have the opportunity to debrief. We have not been good at that over the past years. And now we've hired someone to be able to do that and to really play that role, along with other faculty that students know and feel comfortable with as they're going through these experiences. And brushing up on the latest trends of what's happening on what's happening from where our students are coming from, who are in placements and internships, or who are brand new young professionals. And be kind, supportive, and listening. And who does that better than the world of child life, than all of you as child life professionals? So continue to be open and listening. And I am very pleased to now turn it over to Sam as she shares her personal journey.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to just start by sharing my general child life journey. So I learned about child life when I was in high school. I did a Google search that kind of had a whole bunch of different of my interests in the future, and landed upon the Child Life Council page. And so through that page, I learned about what child life was and some of the programs that were available in colleges. And one of the only in-state schools at the time was Ohio University. And so I went and took a tour there. And that's when I met Jenny for the first time on my tour, and was very much convinced that that's where I was going to go. So I spent the next 4 years studying at OU in Athens, Ohio. And during that time, I did my practicum at Dell Children's Medical Center, which is in Austin, Texas. And then a few months later, completed my internship at Arnold Palmer Children's Hospital in the winter and spring of 2019, where I met Janine. And post-internship, got my first job at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And that's where I've been for the past 2 years. I like to share my journey that way because that's how you introduce yourself a lot of the times to child life people when they ask you, how did you get in the world of child life? And a lot of times I feel like when I'm explaining that, I'm missing pieces that are really important to me, and almost feeling like I'm lying to the person who I'm talking to, because it was not that linear and it was not that clear cut. And so I'm here today to kind of give you my authentic story that I feel like is a story maybe we all need to share, because not everybody's journey is linear. And so here we go. If I was to start my journey and not start with my childhood, I think I would be missing a lot of details. So here's a picture of me and my family when I was kind of in middle school, like junior high age, and the quotes around it are kind of just things that maybe throughout my entire life I've heard a lot, and that I've ruminated a lot, and some of it to this day. But a lot of it's centered on, performance, perfection, and social stuff. So, speaking up and raising your hand and participating more. In my inner world, I'm very much introverted, and throughout my entire life, it's something that I've struggled with. So raising my hand in class and participating has always been something that teachers have pointed out. And so, trying to figure out, how do I participate? I want to participate, but being so fearful of being wrong or being made fun of if I said something silly, and just not participating at all because of those feelings. So a lot of those things followed me to high school. And I think, all of those things sort of building up, kind of those anxiety things building up, but not being able to label that at the time, kind of transitioned into more of a depression, feelings of sadness, and I'm not really sure how I fit in with my peers. I'm not really sure how to express myself in class when I have all these great ideas and want to take those risks, but not the confidence to do so. And so in high school, I began to quit a lot of the things I loved, like soccer and lacrosse. I quit friendships. I isolated myself to my room a lot towards the end of those 4 years. And, as you can see, in the pictures from my sophomore year to my senior year, I, gained a lot of weight from all of that time and just not really knowing what to do. And so I also left a quote from my journal during that time of just how sad I felt, and wanting to, disappear and wondering what it would look like if I disappeared, and just, wanting to escape that pain. I thought that, ending high school would be my way of starting on a new path and pursuing the one thing that I was still passionate about, which was child life. But I quickly learned that that was just another technique of avoiding things, and the things that, I've always experienced followed me to this new place. And I now see that a lot of those things were through avoiding and through, you know, struggling with anxiety. And my way of trying to control it all was perfecting my studies within child life. And so in this image, I think it does a great job of kind of explaining some of what those things I struggled with were. But big thing was, fear of failure. So trying to perfect my studies in a way that made sure that I got my internship my senior year, I got my practicum my junior year, and I graduated in 4 years. And that during that whole time, I was a great candidate by getting that GPA up, and doing all the things that a student needs to do to have a good application, like experiences in the hospital and experiences with children who are in other different settings. And so I spent a lot of time focusing on all of that, while also struggling socially. So I struggled getting and doing things with friends that were fun and not related to child life. So my social life, if it was anything, was doing study groups or hanging out with my cohort after class or in between classes. My weekends were filled with studying and not hanging out with friends or going to the movies or going to a social event. It was making study guides and reading a chapter that says is required that nobody else in my class is reading, but I felt obligated to read, and just being very critical and goal setting of myself. So constantly finding work for myself, the need for improvement, and just pushing and pushing. And if there was a pause, it was a numbing pause. It wasn't a pause of refresh, restart. So just a constant spiral of things. But this was my world. And for me, it was, a struggle and a constant need of perfecting and moving. And to other people, it was, I'm a good student, she's a great tutor, she's hardworking, she's determined, she's independently motivated. And so the poem on the next slide, I think, does a good job of kind of explaining my college experience, and I'll go ahead and read it to you. They announced it on a Monday in our school sweaty hall that a girl that I had math with wasn't coming back at all. You could hear the silent questions. She was perfect, wasn't she? What demons was she fighting that we were too blind to see? I sat in math that Monday beside her now abandoned desk, while our teacher warned us not to fail on our fast approaching test. I remember she once whispered that she was envious of me. My parents knew the work it took just to get a simple B. I wish I'd noticed earlier or had the decency to ask, because her world must have been crumbling behind her perfect student mask. And I wonder if on that Sunday, it was the last thought in her brain that the only A+ she could give was the blood type in her veins. So this poem by Erin Hansen is just, it very much depicts what other people, I feel, from hearing what other people kind of experienced me at that time, thought of me, of being that perfect student or the studious person, the one to go to when you needed help to study or to just talk about something. And got to a point where I was taking 21 credit hours and had 2 field placements and not mental health, 2 field placements and a job during that time. And I very much was super, involved in all of that, and then had schoolwork on top of all of that. And it just became so overwhelming and so isolating and exhausting that on my drive back to class after a field placement, OU is in like an Appalachia region, so it's very hilly. And I was driving past an area of construction where they took a guardrail off, and it had cones in front of the guardrail. And while I was, approaching it, I had an immediate thought of, what if I could drive over this cliff right now? Would it escape all of this pain and all of these thoughts that I just can't get rid of? And that thought terrified me. I somehow made it to class, and for the first time, class wasn't an escape. Child life was an escape for me, and so I sat in class thinking over and over. I got back to my apartment. I didn't eat that night. Very much stayed out all night, and in the morning, I decided that I was scared enough of what my brain was telling me to do that I needed to reach out to someone, and that someone I reached out to is my roommate of 3 years, who was also a child life student. And she made the plan with me to go to the counseling and psychological services on campus that next morning. And when we got there, it was closed. It hadn't opened yet. And I didn't, I wanted to leave very much. And so my roommate knew that if I had left that day, I wouldn't go back. And she sat with me in the waiting room. And that first session was a introductory session. So he just asked me a couple questions about myself and what I was struggling with, and then gave me a phone number to call to set up an actual placement, which anyone with social anxiety knows. A phone call is, not the greatest thing in the world. You struggle to talk in any social situation. So my roommate, again, held me accountable to make that phone call. And when I scheduled that, it was 2 weeks out. So I met with my therapist 2 weeks later. And again, it was another intro session, assessment session. And it wasn't until, maybe 2 weeks together that I was leaving for the holiday and for sending out all my practicum applications for the January 5th deadline. So I don't remember much about that holiday. The holidays are probably my favorite time of the year, and for me to not remember it is pretty difficult. But what I do remember is, the feeling of trying to figure out how to complete all these applications, to hide that I was struggling to my family, and, the worry of what if these applications aren't enough. And so somehow I completed it, got back to OU, got back into therapy, and got 8 interviews. And at the first interview, that's when I disclosed to my therapist the thoughts that I was having. I hadn't done that before break, but we spent a lot of time, through the interview process and school time. We talked a lot about, finding a safe person to talk to, processing what those feelings were like, and a lot of the shame feelings I was having, and trying to boost my confidence a little, especially because I was doing interviews. And by the 8th interview and the 8th denial, this is some of the feedback that I sat across from. And I just want to share it, not in the sense that this feedback is wrong. I very much agree with this feedback, but more so in the the way that I internalized it at the time, and the way someone with a mental health diagnosis might internalize it. So the first two things talk about, you know, gaining more experience or other people having more experience than me. And to me, it was like, holy cow, how much more experience can I get? I'm like literally killing myself trying to get experience, and there's no more time in the day for me to do that. And so just trying to process that was very challenging in my, you know, healing. And the other half, you know, talking about enthusiasm and excitement and courage and confidence. And, you know, part of me is like, well, yes, of course, I'm in therapy and I don't even know how to even talk about myself in any sort of positive fashion. So, you know, I agree, but if this is what's my feedback, then how the heck am I going to get one? Because I, you know, have this diagnosis that's, you know, impeding on my ability to do those things. And so just feeling very angry about my diagnosis and angry at myself for not being able to do those things was just something I, you know, struggled with. So I had one interview left. You can go ahead and move forward. I had one interview left, and that interview, before that interview, I finally decided who that safe person was for me, and that person was Jenny. So I reached out to Jenny and we set up a time to meet together, knowing that I had my last interview the next day. And I disclosed, you know, the things I was struggling with, that I was in therapy, and Jenny welcomed me very warmly, you know, crying with me, embracing me with a hug, and just listening, and then, you know, figuring out what I needed in that exact moment. And for me, it was, you know, I need to figure out how I'm doing this next interview. And so we created a plan. We talked about the feedback that was on the previous screen, and you know, I set off and did the interview. And unfortunately, by the call day, I knew that I wasn't getting it because I didn't receive the call. And so I went back to Jenny's office, and that is when we talked about some of the different ways that I can, you know, different things I can do if I wasn't getting a practicum. And that the day of that meeting, I, you know, left Jenny's office, went to a class, and then after a class and was doing some work with another student, I received a call, and it was from that last place at Dell Children's, and didn't know Texas had a different call day, and that it was 2 weeks later, but they offered me the placement, and of course I accepted. And as soon as I accepted, I immediately started thinking of all the things that, you know, I had just accomplished here, and now I'm moving 16 hours away to a place I know nobody, and where none of my supports I've created are. So these are probably maybe half of the things that spun through my mind that period of time before I set off for the practicum. You know, thinking about my mental health diagnosis and everything that I've done to support myself and heal some of the things that I've been going through, and then moving away from all of that. And one of the biggest questions was, you know, what if they do find out, and would I be any less of a candidate if they did? So I spoke to my therapist and I spoke to Jenny about what that might look like for me when I did go. And my therapist gave me some resources, but unfortunately the waiting period for them was way beyond the time that I was actually going to be there for my entire practicum. It was like a 3-4 month waiting list. So unfortunately I couldn't, you know, use those resources. So Jenny and I created a plan to meet one-on-one in addition to the online course with the peers that you see in this photo, who are also, you know, super supportive to me throughout this entire journey. But Jenny and I often talked about throughout my entire practicum, what if they found out, would I be less of a candidate? And Jenny was always reassuring of me that, I don't think that's what's going to happen. But my anxiety mind wasn't letting me believe that entirely. So it wasn't until my last, you can go ahead, my last maybe 2 or 3 weeks of my practicum, when we were just, us students were sitting and talking to one of our supervisors, Kelly, and she was introducing that in next week we were going to be scheduling a mock interview and a mock practica or internship application process. And my mind started freaking out a little bit. And then she asked us the question of what we were most proud of that week. And my mind freaked out even more because this was the first time I had really reflected on, the whole 3-4 months that I was there. And the first time in a really long time that I was overcome with the emotion of happiness, the emotion of pride in everything that I have overcome. And when she asked me that question, my response in my head was, holy cow, like, you don't understand, like sometimes a few weeks ago, the first thing that, I was proud of was just getting out of bed or just feeding myself a meal. And now I'm sitting here and I've almost completed my practicum and I had no idea that I wasn't even going to be able to do that. And because I was so worked up that day, Kelly was like, we don't have to talk about this in front of the other students. If you want, to meet with me, you can meet with me or you can email me. And so, of course, I was freaking out that I let my emotions escape me. And so I reached out to Jenny and we had that conversation of what if they find out again? And so she encouraged me to email. And so I emailed Kelly and this was her response on the right of the screen. And she, in that response made me feel so completely listened to, heard, seen, loved and cherished. And that was not something that I was used to feeling or, imagined feeling when I shared something that I, had very much struggled with and hated about myself. And so the fact that it was so warm and empathetic, that, encouraged me to start sharing my story to more and more people as I headed back to OU for my internship. And so I did the application process again. And 24 applications later and no interview offers later, I knew by call day that I wasn't getting an internship. So if you understood the story so far, I headed back to Jenny's office again and we created a plan to, 3 good options for me to pursue without an internship. And because of course, in our program, we have to use the internship to graduate. And so there are different things that I had to do that. So we created those plans and I, wanted some time to think about those options. And I reached out to a couple of my mentors, some at Dell and some other people that I just wanted to, keep in touch with. And one of them came back with a hospital that was still looking for an intern. And so I reached out to that hospital and they, allowed me to send my application and offered me an interview. And when I did that, I met Janine for the first time in my interview. And at the end of the interview, she offered me the placement, which was crazy because here I was again, just thinking about all the possible things that could be happening when I move 14 hours away to Florida, and not knowing anybody and knowing that I had done it before and figuring out ways of how to do it again. But this time, a practicum is very observational, and I knew the expectation of an intern is to become the child life specialist. And so the big question that came in my mind was how am I going to be able to support patients and families with their anxiety or their coping when I can't even, do that myself sometimes. And does that make me a hypocrite? Does that make me less of a person or a child life specialist that I can't do those things? And so that was, because of Kelly's response and because of Jenny's response, that this time I made the decision to be more open about these things and this question in my mind to Janine when I, initially started my internship. And as Janine will talk about later, her philosophy at Arnold Palmer and all of the people she supervised is, to encourage students to take those risks and to have moments of falling on your face, even though you're taking the risk, and learning from those moments. And as we all know from those earlier slides, failure and falling is not in my vocabulary. And so when she said these things, internally I was freaking out, but also, trusting that they weren't going to put me in a situation where that I wouldn't fail so completely that I had to leave. But yeah, so just really, really learning and growing these next, 4 months was insane. Some of the ways that Janine and I, met and talked were through supervision and through my journaling. I feel like my supervisors probably, in some ways did the same things, but Janine and I think spent a lot of time processing some of these shame thoughts that I still had in my mind, whether they presented themselves in a journal or just in our conversations. A lot of those things were, I wish I would have, or I hope that next time I will, or, I'm feeling this emotion, but not acting on it, and how those things play out. And so I created this graph that kind of showed those process in a broken down way. But, the shame thought of, I am a failure. I did something and I am a failure, and shifting it to a more guilt-based where there's some growth behind it. So I have made a single mistake. So I'm not a failure. I've just made this single mistake, and how can I grow from that? And it's okay to have, that guilt feeling after a mistake. So how are we going to reframe it and grow from it? And so, asking the question of how might this mistake or setback help me learn or grow? And what will I do next time to, get me further, or show that I've learned from it? And then the big question, what my mental health diagnosis makes me unable to help others. And shifting that shame feeling to my mental health diagnosis has impacted the way I help others, and then reframing it to what are some ways to help my identity or help me identify when this might be occurring. So when might my emotions be impacting the care I'm giving, or how might my emotions impact my own well-being while at the hospital? And then, promoting resilience. So are there some ways that maybe my experiences and my mental health in my journey to child life, may have had a positive impact on me and may influence the way I can help patients and families just because I relate to them in a different way than someone who might not have, these mental health experiences. And so I completed my internship. I don't think there's enough words probably for me to describe that experience, but I headed back home and graduated. And for the first time, I feel like I was, seeing color and seeing beauty in like even the smallest of things. And for the first time, also seeing my entire journey behind me and not feeling like that journey defined me in a negative light, that all the mistakes and failures and mishaps and setbacks and, you know, things I've had to learn were, you know, beautiful things and what made me who I am. And then the beads that I'm holding kind of illustrate this image of that learning process. So at Arnold Palmer, the interns get a string of beads from like Beads of Courage stuff. And each bead represents different milestones in an internship. And so that's kind of how I, you know, describe my journey during my internship. So now transitioning to me working as a child life specialist, some of the biggest struggles that I've had are just, you know, feeling the imposter syndrome that I think a lot of us feel, and trying to figure out life after a student. So, you know, now I go home, there's no homework. What do I do with that time? Who am I beyond child life? Because I've spent so much time making child life my world. And just still ruminating and reflecting on things that I do at work, and how do I control that? And then the biggest one, you know, being at the top of the mountain. So child life was the goal for so long, and here I am, a child life specialist. And the one thing that, you know, maybe would take it up to the next peak was my ultimate dream that I, you know, initially brought to the world when I Googled counselor in pediatric oncology setting and found child life, would be that oncology aspect. And so 11 months after getting the child life role, I'm suddenly at the very, very tip of any dream that I've ever had. And how do I stay there and not forward think of what would be next? So these are all things that I deal with today. And so, you know, thinking about the things that I kind of implement in my work, everyday work, just to keep me going. I think some of the biggest things are just, I'm constantly forgiving myself for whatever risk I took and didn't turn out great. You know, using Jenny and Janine and professors from previous or mentors from previous experiences in my head on like, you know, this is a rumination thought, hold it back, Sam, or rein it in. I have a gratitude journal that sits at my desk. I try and focus on listening to music or listening to certain things that are more positive. I have a tendency to lean towards sad music, and so I force myself to listen to that positive playlist. Identifying safe people at the hospital or within my life to just talk about things, being more open while I'm at the hospital too on, you know, managers and leads of like, hey, I'm struggling today. This is what's happening. I just need a minute, and figuring things out like that. Some of the advice that I would give professionals or clinical collegiate settings is kind of what Jenny had mentioned before. The first thing I would probably say is just being aware and knowledgeable about the ways that you should respond to a crisis. National Suicide Prevention has really good resources on what those look like. You know, just knowing how to respond to someone, I think just makes them more able to do it in the future. And it makes you more confident in your abilities to support someone in that situation. So these are just some of the things that I've had people in my life use when they kind of respond to me when I'm in a crisis that are helpful. And just thinking of different things maybe to implement in your location, or just the things that I've been talking about throughout. So creating a mindset or a culture that, you know, you should be vulnerable and you should take risk, and that does not make you any less of a person. being patient with them and celebrating, all of the things. So whether it's good, whether it's, an achievement or it's the epic fail, be there and celebrate it. Help them, process and reframe the language they might be telling themselves, whether it's in a dialogue or in their own words in an assignment, helping them figure that out. And then I'm thinking of growth opportunities within the profession. So I feel like Jenny kind of touched base on a lot of this, but starting the conversation early. So can we talk about emotion? Where can we talk about mental health in the beginning, where students are coming in college and learning about these things and learning about child life? Can we make that conversation happen earlier? Whether it's feedback or learning from being vulnerable and taking risks. Staying current on college life and child life, student life, knowing how many applications students are sending out and knowing how much it takes and how much money it takes to get those things to happen, and what sort of mental health aspect happens when you're sending out that many and you're managing different interviews and things like that. And then just being an advocate. And if you haven't read this quote already, I encourage you to do so. But it's the Man in the Arena quote from Theodore Roosevelt that Brene Brown, a social worker who has lots of great research on vulnerability, just being in the arena with us when we take those risks and when we dare greatly, and be there when we fall and be there when we succeed, and just help us grow. So I will pass the mic to Janine.
Okay. And I get the hard job of being the anchor in this triad and following up two really insightful and amazing women that I feel very lucky to be connected to. So both Jenny and Sam talk about mental health and being aware of mental health issues, but what do we really know about mental health in child life practice? We know that there's mental health issues for kids. We know we're developing more mental health units in hospitals, but what do we know about current trends in mental health? So here's just a couple of questions to think about for yourself. Students with average or below average grades are more likely to have mental health issues, which is actually not true. We think of people who are underperformers as the people who are challenged with mental health, but it's typically, like Sam, students who are perfectionists, who are overachievers. And the research supports that, that those who are highest achieving are most likely to have those mental health issues, some of which help them be successful, like anxiety and perfectionism. But in the end, it can be their biggest downfall to being successful in their career. So the National Institute of Mental Health is a great resource for information. And currently, they're saying 1 in 5 people have a mental health condition. And the important feature to know about this is that statistically, 75% of those people are in the age range of students that we are all working with. And so the likelihood that you're encountering students with mental health issues is really great. So what do we think the most common mental health condition is in the United States? Based on the pandemic, prior to the pandemic even, it's actually anxiety. And the trick about it is that even though people have anxiety, the stigma around having a mental health diagnosis, even as something as commonplace as anxiety, people are not seeking treatment because of the stigma related to having a mental health diagnosis. Fatigue is normal in interns. True. However, fatigue is a common sign of a mental health disorder because it indicates people are not having balanced functioning. Either they're not sleeping because they're anxious or because they're sleeping too much because they're depressed, which then your body becomes more fatigued from sleeping too much. So making sure that signs of pretty common internship behaviors are not being overlooked because there's a mental health diagnosis that's driving some of those health issues. And people with mental health disorders are more prone to violence. I think that's one of the things we always worry about. And we see sometimes in the emergency rooms where people have mental health issues and they are violent. It's actually statistically less likely to be true in people with mental health issues. It falls to a very specific range of mental health issues, which we don't typically see in internship students, but generally it's less likely to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about mental health conditions that are common to internships and internship students. And this information was taken not just from child life students, but from healthcare interns. So medical students, Aclp, physical therapy, nursing students, people like that, across the board. And so anxiety is clearly the very first one. And anxiety, according to the DSM, is broken down into several categories. These are the most common ones that we see in clinical placements. But anxiety is really a fear-based mental health issue that relates to real or perceived fear of a threat, imminent or otherwise. And sometimes those fears are real, like, jumping from a high place, my fear is that I'm going to fall and kill myself, break a leg. Those are real fears. Sometimes they're fears of things that are not as evident, as clear or logical. And so it's important to make some distinction between real and perceived fear. And we see that in kids, right, in the hospital. And this is where child life practice really gets to be helpful in mental health disorders, because kids will fear things in the hospital that aren't going to happen, but they don't know that. In their head, their anxiety is telling them it's true. So I pulled out 3 photographs of celebrities who have been very good mental health advocates to help understand that mental health is an issue even in people who are very high performing folks. So, Oprah Winfrey, social anxiety. It's Oprah Winfrey. She talks to 1 million people. How does she have social anxiety? It's because she's functional and she knows how to manage it. Katy Perry, she's a singer. It's her job to be a performer. And how does she have performance anxiety? So it's important to understand the differences in these types of anxieties and how they will relate to students. So generalized anxiety disorder is about disproportionate fear of multiple types of activities. It isn't just one, like talking to new people. It's doing things like talking to new people. It's performing. It's a change in routine, for example, which if you think about the day in the life of a child life specialist, it's all about change in routine. And so people who have generalized anxiety disorder, you may find them wanting to have a specific game plan, trying to do a lot of rehearsal, organizing their day down to the minute, because that helps them manage their anxiety. But it is a little counterintuitive into the work of a child life specialist. And so making sure that you are following with your student to help them understand why those things are hard and help them develop coping strategies around the unique features of being a child life specialist. Social anxiety. Oh, let's go back real quick. So social anxiety, again, talking to new people. If we think about the work of a child life specialist, we're talking to new people all the time. Parents, sometimes talking to physicians, even those days where the student, picks up the ASCOM and it's their job to carry around the phone and answer the phone for the specialist, right? Anxiety producing. And so you may find that students are really struggling to be successful at those activities because they have a hard time with their social anxiety and talking to people. And performance anxiety. Most internships require students to do some sort of presentation, even talking to community agencies, like, if you have teddy bear clinics or things like that, where they have to represent their work as a student or the child life department, those types of performances can be really stressful for students. And you may find them struggling to be successful simply because they have a pre-existing mental health issue that makes that difficult. Okay, there we go. Depression. Most people think that depression is all about sadness and withdrawal. And oftentimes, particularly in younger people, depression presents as anger and irritability, tearfulness, deep feelings of, worthlessness as an individual, which makes some of the challenges with doing the tasks of internship difficult. So if we think about the idea that students will have to do things like self-evaluations, that's really difficult if you don't think very much of yourself, right? Being tearful, and is it in response to something that they witnessed? Is it in response to getting some critical feedback about their performance? Is it appropriate? Is it not? I think are all important to keep in mind with depression. Things like fatigue. Are students showing up to internship on time? or not because they're oversleeping? Are they oversleeping because they're sleeping too much because they're depressed? It's a bit of a cycle. And so asking good questions, being open to what students have to say can be helpful. Adjustment disorder. So most students have to relocate somewhere in the country, away from home, oftentimes away from resources, to do an internship. And so lots of students experience what's called adjustment disorder. Now, the good thing about adjustment disorder is it's typically short-lived, 3 to 6 months. But at the time that it's happening, it's got some fairly consistent features of anxiety. You know, I like to know, I like to be predictable. I like to know what's going on. I'm nervous about talking to new people. I want to rehearse these things. It may have some depressive features because they're missing family from home, things like that, but they aren't severe enough to be diagnosed as anxiety disorder or depressive disorder, and typically last as long as internship lasts until they can get back to their social groups, their home, things like that. Acute stress disorder is something that we're seeing a lot in healthcare workers right now in relationship to the pandemic. But for students, one of the pieces to keep in mind is that stress disorders, like when we think of PTSD, acute stress disorder is a precursor to that, comes from a sense of feeling helpless in a situation. And so if you think about a student who's maybe in the ER and a horrific trauma comes in, they might not be the right go-to person, and they may feel a little helpless to be involved in that situation and be effective. The same can be true for what's called observer trauma, where they are in a position of watching and not feeling like they can be helpful to anybody in the room. And it might be different things for different students. Some of it, I'll own it for myself, is the ER. The ER makes me nervous every time I walk into it. But for some students, it may be things like if they were doing a rotation in the ICU and they saw a child recovering with an open chest. Some of it might be amputation. Some of it might be death. I've had students with acute stress disorder because a student, they were working with me on a bereavement, and it was the first person that they'd ever had in their whole life that died. And so they can develop acute stress disorder from that. Acute stress disorder can be short-lived with the right intervention and getting the right support for it so that it doesn't last beyond a certain point in time in which they can process their emotions, process their feelings, identify strategies for minimizing a sense of helplessness in the future as a student. So, okay. These are less likely to happen, but have been noted in the literature. And they're specific phobias. And sometimes students don't even know they have these until they roll in the door. So things like emetophobia. It's not fear of other people vomiting, it's fear of their own vomiting. They don't want to vomit because vomiting is about control. Vomiting is about embarrassment and things like that. And so it's important that when students talk about throwing up, that we process that with them, get them to a safe place, help them process it. And if it continues over time, that's a sign that you need to have somebody assess them for this type of phobia. Germaphobic, you know, people who are afraid of blood, those are things that, you know, most of the time people will say, oh, no, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And then they actually get into the clinical setting where they're exposed to it and they have all of the equipment around them and all the extra people and all the things that come along with those. And they're like, suddenly they're struggling. And so it's important to understand that these are things students may not be aware of when they walk in the door. I also think it's important to point out that there can be other phobias that we haven't even mentioned in the literature. And I always pull up Whoopi Goldberg because I think she's a fascinating person, but she is a well-known fear of flying person. And so she had a bus maid that she travels the country in. So she has learned how to accommodate her fear of flying. And so not all of us can do it in that same way, but it's important to understand that there can be accommodations made for phobias to help students. It's just a matter of having a conversation and being open to the conversation. So mental health in supervision is important. And, you know, Sam pointed some of this out that, you know, we as clinical supervisors are the first point of introduction for students into a clinical setting. We're the first person that meets with them. And so we set the tone about vulnerability, mental health disclosure, the relationship that we have with students from the get-go. And so it's important for clinical supervisors to be aware that students may be coming in with these issues, and we need to be open to them offering that to us and being safe people to disclose that to, so that we can, again, as Sam discussed, pace with them, know their issues ahead of time so that we know how to work with them to help them see their process in a different light, different perspective. But there are obstacles to providing good mental health support in clinical supervision. The first is generational diversity. So the stigma for mental health was much more severe for people who are, say, in the baby boomer generation, right? You didn't talk about it. That was not the thing. And as generations have gone along, mental health disclosure and discussion has gotten better. It's not great, but it's better. And so when we have really new young students who are trying to disclose mental health issues to older generation X, boomers, whatever, folks who maybe don't have that same comfort level with mental health issues, it's important to understand that we need to adapt to their needs and we need to provide good support for that. And that might mean that we need to do some education for ourselves, things like that. Characteristics of the mental health issue are important. So if you have a student that has performance anxiety or social anxiety, for example, and you're asking them to do the thing that's scary to them by disclosing mental health or talking about mental health, again, that's going to make it much more challenging. And so understanding that what you're asking a student to do is terrifically difficult and to be receptive to that. They might have to hem and haw for a while or look around the room or twiddle their thumbs, or, I had fidget toys in my office for people who really needed that stimulation to kind of help get through what they needed to talk about. The other one is transference, because we've maybe all experienced challenges with supervisors, bosses, parents, teachers, where things didn't really go very well. It was a tough relationship for whatever reason. And so students may be struggling to disclose or share mental health issues or concerns with supervisors because they're seeing you as somebody else, somebody who maybe wasn't as receptive, somebody who wasn't as kind to them. And the similar fact of it could be too that supervisors are seeing their students as someone else. Maybe it's a student that they had before that wasn't very successful. Maybe they have some similarities to a child who was a struggle for you. And so making sure that you are identifying the person in front of you as who they are, the issues are unique, they are unique as a person, and really thinking about how do you do supervision for the supervisor to make sure that those relationships are authentic. It's important to point out the ACLP position statement on clinical supervision, because I think there's some really good points to be made in here. And what I really like about this is that it doesn't distinguish the difference between the student and the supervisor. And so, development of the practitioner's self-assessment and self-evaluation skills. That could be the supervisor, it could be the student, okay? And so making sure that, that old statement, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. As clinical supervisors, we need to be as self-aware and self-reflective as we are asking our students to be. We need to understand what it's like to be vulnerable and put our mental health or our fears and worries out on the table, because that's what we're asking students to do. So we need to know what that experience is like. And so I think following the clinical supervision statement is an important piece, and making sure that we are doing supervision for the supervisors and that they have an opportunity to talk through their experiences as clinical supervisors will be important. So internship is stressful, right? We just can't make that different. It's hard work. And so let's talk a little bit about anxiety in clinical learning situations. And it's important to understand that there will always be anxiety. And an acceptable level of anxiety is one that does not cause impairment, okay? So if you have a student who has to literally rehearse every procedure before they walk into it 3 times, that's a signal to you that something isn't going right. Something needs to be addressed, because that's impairment, because that's not possible in clinical practice, right? For those of you who've been doing this work for a long time, you know that sometimes you just have to walk down the hall and do teaching in preparation for this kid as they're being wheeled to surgery. You can't teach that. You can't practice that. It's just part of the way it is. And so part of helping students understand the changeable nature of the work that we do is necessary for the job. And so to minimize their anxiety about the fact that they can't predict everything, we cannot control for everything. It's part of the nature of the beast, so that they can feel more normalized and that this is the way it is. It's not that they aren't being good predictors. It's not that they aren't doing enough chart review. It's that this is the nature of the beast. This is the normal part of the work, so that they feel like they're as behind as you are, right? These are some other things to look for. Students who cannot provide a balanced self-evaluation, right? They cannot think of one good thing they did in that procedure, whether it's vocal tone, stance, inclusion of parents, not one thing. And if that's consistently true, then that's something that you want to be aware of. Sleeping and eating impairments. Is it, again, the student that shows up late to internship every day because they're oversleeping? Is it the student who skips lunch every day because they're so busy like studying and practicing and whatever? Probably an issue. Students who are frequently tearful, hiding in the bathroom, crying their eyes out. You find them in the playroom crying. They're crying during supervision. Those are things you want to be on the lookout for. Students who have panic attack and end up in your ER as a patient because they're panicking. Those are things you want to be aware of and help them get connected to resources that can assess them, provide them good resources for ongoing mental health support. So as supervisors, clinicians, preceptors, it's really important for us to educate ourselves about mental health issues so that we have a greater comfort with not only talking about them, but actually understanding what we're seeing in front of us. This is not about assessment. This is not about diagnosing people. It's about recognizing. So if we think about patients that come into the hospital, our job is to recognize when patients are anxious. What does that anxiety look like for them? How is that playing out? And that's true for students. We need to be able to recognize the behaviors of mental health challenges, words, nervous habits, things like that. And these are some resources that can offer that baseline education about mental health for clinicians. And typically these are free. Some of them have a small fee for them, but they're really good informational pieces that give you that basic introduction. Model. I'm a big fan of modeling. And as Sam mentioned, we talked about the epic fail and modeling humanity in clinical practice. I always like to predict the epic fail. I want you to fail. An epic fail in my mind is that experience that we all have it as students, is that, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I just did that. I'm so embarrassed. I want to run and hide in the bathroom. Everybody's going to remember this forever. But the thing that makes you want to crawl under a rock, right? I want students to have that. I want them to have it as an intern where we have that safety net around them to talk them through what happened, to give them an opportunity to replay, redo, build some time under their belt so that they don't walk away with stress from that experience. And so I like to predict that it's going to happen. I always tell students my epic fail story from when I was an intern, again, to model that it happens to everybody. It happens to all clinicians, especially clinicians who are willing to take the risk and do things that are new and different. But I think what's important about the epic fail, and Jenny, can you click it again? Is when it happens, your students are going to feel like they're falling, okay? And it's really important for us to tell students that we're going to be there to catch them when it happens. Okay, as soon as this happens, I want you to come to my office and tell me all about it. And they do, and they're sweaty and, but we do the breathing, we talk them down, we talk about what happened, we break it down into moments, and then we talk about what did you learn from this, okay? Because it's important to understand failure as a learning opportunity. And then it's important to understand idealized self-care for students. How many times do we ask the interview question for students, how do you take care of yourself in times of stress? And they all say running, right? No, they don't. They idealized self-care is what social convention tells us it should be. Oh, we should be a runner. Oh, I should do yoga. Oh, I should do meditation. And those are all great. And I totally support all of those things. But most oftentimes, that's not what people do first. The first thing they do is they sit down and they eat that ice cream. Okay. And so to normalize self-care for students and make sure that they're doing it, because self-care isn't really a reactive tool. It should be a proactive tool. That's really the first step in the process of catharsis and then meaning making. So I had this horrible experience. I don't know what to do with it. How do I make meaning out of what happened? What did I learn from it so that I can come back the next day and do this all over again? And in that process, if we do self-care every day, then it can help us be in a more resilient place to have that discussion with ourselves or with another trusted person about, oh, well, this didn't really go very well. What did I learn from it? What am I going to do differently? What parts did I really do well in an otherwise horrible experience? So that way they have a better balanced self-evaluation, gives them a better tool to do that. And I think, again, normalizing our own self-care models. You know, I always talk to my students, I'm not the runner. I'll be the first person to admit that. I go home and bake cookies because it's a little bit of controlled outcome. It always helped me minimize my stress and gave me time to process things. So normalizing self-care by processing out what you do can be helpful for students. And then plan. You know, as Jenny pointed out, you know, students move away for internship and campus healthcare or facilities do not necessarily always cover students when they're far away. As I learned, employee health services, occupational health services do not cover students. And so that pushes you out into the community. And as you know, Sam pointed out, finding a therapist in a community, especially now in the time of COVID, is challenging. And so wait lists tend to be long. And so create a plan in your department. Okay, what are we going to do if we have a student that has a mental health crisis? Where are our resources? Who are our go-to people? How can we support them so that they don't have to leave internship? They can stay here, they can be successful and complete their internship in a way that feels not only ethical, and help students be competent in a way that's reflective of the verification forms, but also so that they feel good about their experience and can leave it feeling successful and maybe, like Sam, have a bit of a shift into a better mental health model where she has learned some skills about how to be a balanced clinician, identify when she's struggling, reach out for resources, things like that. And then there's some resources here at the end, whether it's articles or organizations that can help give you information about mental health services, mental health diagnoses, things like that.
And at this point, we'd like to open it up. We have a few minutes left to see if anybody has any questions, either speak up or put it in the chat box. And thank you all so much for your time today.
Mm-hmm.